Broder encapsulates the taboo violation with an ironic sentence that he used as a chapter heading and borrowed from the Israeli psychoanalyst Zvi Rex. Is he alive still, or?
My eyes not known. I mean, I know what he said.
Okay, that's a very, because this is often, and he said, of course, the famous quote is, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. The Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. I think very, very telling. By the way, and maybe later on we can discuss it at dinner with Don Diener, who's here on the faculty, really brilliant guy, and he's come out with a major book on Islam and post-colonialism, and I actually agree with him. We both said that what is in the process is in fact a complete deconstruction of the post-war primacy of Auschwitz in this discourse, which already, for instance, you see France very strongly, again started by the left. May 8th, of course, is the end of World War II. But there's also something else going on. The French army commits a major atrocity in Algeria. And this is now, again, I'm not trying to exculpate here the French army, but this is a new entering into the debate about memory, which in fact anthropologists, sorry to go off the topic, but it's relevant, which sort of anthropologizes historic, in other words, it becomes kind of a notion which is very much part of post-colonialism, a notion of all human suffering, and in fact, in this case, the French left argues that that day should be, is not only a liberation of France, or the end of World War II, but also France's atrocities, or the First World's atrocities against the Third World people. And so you kind of see this putting the context of challenging, in this case, again, crudely put, Auschwitz. And in this case, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. Secondary anti-Semitism may be distinguished from ordinary anti-Semitism, with which, however, it shares most of the usual stereotypes, by its defense mechanism against guilt. This phenomenon was first described by the two legendary members of the Frankfurt School, of course, Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Although their writings, to be sure, on National Socialism are woefully deficient in many respects, particularly the virtual silence about anti-Semitism's centrality to Nazism, they did address the way post-war German society dealt with the Shoah. In particular, they observed how, while Germans continued to detest Jews, the age-old anti-Semitism had attained an additional dimension because the psychological mechanism involved, which of course was so important to Adorno and Horkheimer, they called it Schuldabwehr-Antisemitismus, which best translates, if at all, into guilt-defensiveness anti-Semitism. In other words, that you are becoming anti-Semitic because you are, or additionally anti-Semitic because you are being placed and boxed into this guilt, which of course enrages you. Actually, maybe we can even turn down the heat a little. Is that okay? I'm the one who instigated the heat, so.
This is like out of the pages of Nietzsche.
What?
This ressentiment being made to feel guilty.
Yeah, should have, yeah. It's actually even maybe better than Nietzsche's. Actually, it's Scheler, Max Scheler's work. Right. Of course, uses it. Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about a major speech by a key figure in 1998, which I happen to have actually experienced while I was in Berlin for a year. Which begins, or really becomes very important, this whole new uninhibitedness. And I would argue, again, coming back to the left, coincides with the coming to government of a red-green coalition of Gerhard Schröder and Joschka Fischer, who, God beware, I don't mean to accuse of any kind of anti-Semitism. He's probably one of the very few politicians, although not anymore, but politicians in Europe who was, I would argue, a true friend of Israel. And so, but still, I think it coincides with this massive change on the 27th of September 1998, where you have a new German government, which is clearly post-war, okay, which is really has a Gnade der späten Geburt, because it was born after the war, and in fact has the important bonus of being a left government. And in fact, I would argue it has this phenomenon that we now see with Sharon or de Gaulle or Nixon, whatever, that it's precisely a group that is beyond suspicion that can do things that another group couldn't do. So there's absolutely no question that the Kohl government would have never committed German troops to the Kosovo War. It took a the first German troops deployed out of area, which the Germans called out of area in English, was committed by a 1948-born former leftist radical, hippie, activist, funky foreign minister, Europe's most interesting politician, and Joschka Fischer. Had the CDU been in power, Joschka Fischer would have been at the head of the demonstration against the war. Okay? In the Frankfurt Paulskirche, a very eminent place, because after all, this was where the ill-fated German bourgeois democracy was declared in 1848, which then collapsed. A German writer by the name of Martin Walser, very, very big in the German-speaking world, I think rightly not very big in the rest of the world, was awarded the Peace Prize for the German book trade, which is a big deal. It's probably the biggest prize in the German-speaking world, and it's also a big kind of social event. It's always held on a Sunday. Susan Santa got it a couple of years ago, and as the French would say, tout l'Allemagne, everybody who's anybody is at this gig. Okay? And Walser's speech sparked what I would have called the first anti-Semitism debate or dispute in the United Germany. What I'm referring here, of course, was to the original famous anti-Semitism dispute, which was triggered in 1879 by the famous historian Heinrich von Treitschke, who published an article accusing Germany's Jews of insufficient willingness to assimilate, and it led to the big debate between Treitschke and Mommsen, the two major historians of the time. He basically, I'll talk about the debate in a minute. He used many anti-Semitic tropes, basically accusing Jews, or the whole debate in the post-war Germany, of having a cudgel, an Auschwitz cudgel that kind of intimidates and emasculates the German people. The Walser debate has not been resolved to this day, and indeed he continues. He published a equally powerful book called Tod eines Kritikers, Death of a Critic, in which he reiterates all these positions from 1998. The novel features a Jewish character who has the vilest traits of standard anti-Semitism. He's greedy, haughty, arrogant, oversexed, speaking in Polish accented German, and he's clearly recognizable as a Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, one of the most important German cultural critics on television and for Germany's paper of record, the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, who is, of course, of Polish Jewish origin. A recent book by a young German academic, actually his doctoral dissertation, Matthias Lorenz, titled Auschwitz drängt uns auf einen Fleck, Auschwitz pushes us onto one spot, presents very, very powerful evidence that Walser's work in general bears major elements of anti-Semitism dating back to his seemingly left radical beginnings in the early 1960s.
Can you repeat the title, please?
The title is Auschwitz drängt uns auf einen Fleck. Matthias Lorenz. Among other things, Lorenz reveals that Walser, in a speech honoring the late Viktor Klemperer, who may be of maybe knowledge to you, I think in some ways his 2 volumes probably the best eyewitness accounts of Nazi Germany ever written. He survived Nazi Germany in Berlin, professor of Romance languages. Klemperer, an assimilated German Jew who survived the Nazi regime by staying in Berlin and wrote a popular testimonial of this experience, which I just mentioned, argued that, and Walser argued that the Holocaust would never have occurred had all German and European Jews assimilated as successfully as did Klemperer. It should be noted, by the way, that had Klemperer, despite his total assimilation, by the way, not been married to a German Gentile woman, I think it's quite clearly that he too would have been sent to death camp. The fact that even Chancellor Schroeder expressed solidarity with Walser during the 2002 election campaign indicates the reversal that has occurred since Germany was in fact united. In his speech on 11 October 1998, Walser referred to, this is the famous speech on the Paulskirche, referred to the constant recalling of Germany's crimes in the Holocaust as, and I quote, permanent representation of our shame. He deplored a quote, instrumentalization of our shame for current purposes, and again, a quote, a negative nationalism that was disseminated by intellectuals, quote again, and opinion soldiers, Meinungssoldaten. These, he claimed, used the memory of the Holocaust by holding it, quote, at a moral gunpoint as a, quote, a means of intimidation deployable at any time in order to hurt all Germans by thwarting Germans' national pride and self-satisfaction. Walser, to be sure, was not the first to speak of the so-called Auschwitz cudgel, Auschwitz Keule, but he gave such notions his poetic blessing. Toward the end of his speech, the audience in the church rose to give him a tumultuous standing ovation. Among the 1,200 guests, the thank you address for the Peace Prize for the German book trade being a major cultural event were important representatives of the political, cultural, media, and business elites. Apart from an East German Lutheran minister by the name of Friedrich Schorlemmer, who you should know and perhaps invite, maybe, whatever, only 2 people other than Friedrich Schorlemmer did not rise to applaud: the then chairman of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, the late Ignaz Bubis, and his wife. What is notable about this speech, in addition to its latently anti-Semitic message about remembering the past and the enthusiasm with which it was greeted, is that it was given by a writer, an intellectual who was a member of the German left. Walser, born in 1927 in Wasserburg and holding a doctorate in literature, had behaved like many other German intellectuals of his age. In the 1960s, he was a big advocate of Willy Brandt as chancellor and opposed the war in Vietnam. And in the 1970s, he actually sympathized, though never really joined, sympathized with the small West German Communist Party called DKP. Then already, however, in 1987, Walser told the weekly left-liberal German magazine Stern, and I quote, "For a while one rides on the guilt and atonement train because one simply has to travel along. But during the journey one is thinking about entirely different things," unquote. This well expresses the feelings of much of the German elite, both on the right and left. Following Walser's speech, articles tended to characterize the speech on the Paulkirche as thought-provoking, stimulating, even courageous. Only after Ignaz Bubis gave a lecture on the 60th anniversary of Kristallnacht, which was November 9, 1998, so a couple of weeks later, in which he analyzed the speech and accurately characterized it as essentially deeply troubling and anti-Semitic, was there noticeable rise in criticism of Walser. Yet it was, interestingly, precisely the German left that mostly remained silent. I spent that academic year in Berlin and experienced firsthand how leftists responded to Bubis and the controversy surrounding him with either embarrassment or indifference, with one important exception, the left-wing magazine Konkret and its editor Hermann Gremlitzer, whose solidarity with Bubis was unqualified. Only in two rare cases were there acts of opposition to the ever-growing cross-party sense of uninhibitedness about anti-Semitism in the public discourse, and more important, the society's emotional repertoire. The first was a gathering at Humboldt University in Berlin on 8 March 1999, at which I shared the podium with Gremlitzer and Bubis. The second was a lengthy interview that Bubis gave Gremlitzer in Konkret. These were expressions of an otherwise scant solidarity with Bubis, especially outside the Jewish community. Let me contextualize this to you briefly. Konkret is this, it's a very pedigreed, very interesting, has undergone many changes. It was actually one of the major writers from Konkret and editors was Ulrike Meinhof, the notorious or Red Army faction leader, actually. By the way, of course, as you well know, very apropos, with the film coming out, a major applauder and advocate and welcomer of the massacre of the Israeli athletes. I'll talk about Ulrike Meinhof a little later. Konkret was this it's the most pedigreed German left-wing intellectual voice, started in the early 60s, actually 50s even, late 50s. And it underwent a lot of changes, and since 1991, I mean, it was edited already before, it kind of took a very interesting turn. It's the only left-wing voice, Don Diener and I talked about this yesterday, which is kind of really an old relic. It is a post-World War II sort of, a World War II creation. It extols the Soviet Union. It loves the Red Army and loves the US Army, and it kind of has this pro-Western leftist, pro-Israeli leftist position. Not by chance, it is this publisher that picked up my book in Germany like this, published it in less than 3 weeks, and it's now in its 3rd edition, coming into its 4th edition. Precisely a very small leftist group that is pro-Israeli and pro-American. Interesting group, has a lot to do with Gremlitzer. So, but nevertheless, it's a sect, to be honest. It's a sect. And here is Bubis, who by this time already had pretty bad back problems, and he flew in from Frankfurt for this gig in Berlin in front of these, leftist freaks, more or less. And I kind of sensed, I talked to him a little bit about this, and I sensed what a lonely guy this must be. That he comes to this and senses that this is the only place where, in fact, he is, for 2 hours, he will be really applauded. He'll be welcomed. He will not. So I found this fascinating, that a guy who otherwise would only converse with the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or with the Financial Times or, the major publication in the world would take the time and trouble to come to a thing at the Humboldt University organized by this leftist sectarian weirdo group, from his point of view, completely non-fitting, and then would take almost a day with Gremlitzer to do this detailed interview. To me, this was kind of testimony of how alone he really was. Gerhard Schröder, a politician with, I think, brilliant instinct for the German emotional repertoire, staged a debate with Walser on the subject of the nation on 8 May 2002. A random date, 8 May. In the middle of his re-election campaign, when Michael Friedmann, the then vice chairman of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, questioned the chancellor's choice after he invited the novelist to share the podium with him on, again, such a random date, he was shot down as being basically a kind of a monger of the fear and so on. The forthright rejection of the criticism of this event, featuring Walser and the Chancellor on the same stage, clearly indicates the paradigm shift that occurred in Germany and the attack on Friedman. Former cultural minister and a very eminent philosopher, Julian Niederrümelin, emphasized that Walser was, and he said, I'm quoting, a key literary and intellectual figure in Germany. According to Niederrümelin, who then was cultural minister, Walser was a writer who had already started to deal with the all-important and in post-war Germany much neglected concept of the nation. Inviting Walser then was in fact a very wise choice by the Chancellor. Then SPD Secretary General Franz Müntefering, who later succeeded Schröder as party chairman, actually he's now gone, that indignantly rejected the accusations. I quote once again, okay, the German way, formerly just an electoral campaign, one could celebrate a political culture of openness and tolerance in Germany. We in Germany, this is something we say in a sense of pride in our country, self-critical but also self-confidently patriotic, are allowed to do this. Okay? In other words, a social democratic chancellor and a social democratic secretary general expressed tolerance toward a writer who had openly and repeatedly made anti-Semitic statements. The paradigm shift that has occurred in public and political debate in Germany is well, I think, symbolized by this event. There has been a political upgrading or indirect acceptance of secondary anti-Semitism as a defense mechanism against remembering the German past and a means of national identity mobilization. How much, when should I stop?
Another 10 minutes?
Another 10 minutes, fine, not a problem. Couple of other brief examples. Two books by Jörg Friedrich. This uninhibitedness about the Nazi past is not only a debate about Jews. Increasingly, all aspects of history have really are being now reinterpreted. Two books, very important books, by Jörg Friedrich, one of them is called The Fire, the other one is called Fire Sites. Again, Friedrich, a radical leftist. Friedrich actually wrote a brilliant book on Nazi past of German lawyers, or Nazi past of important West German legal profession. Okay, that was his major publication. He published this book on The Fire, as a comprehensive work on, quote, the campaign to exterminate German cities systematically planned and implemented by Britons and Americans. This is a quote from the dust cover of the book, and it clearly